Now, Wales's First Minister, Mark Drakeford, has said he supports in principle the setting up of an independent public inquiry into the handling of the coronavirus pandemic. But in a virtual meeting of the Welsh Parliament, he came under pressure to give a timetable for it to begin. From the Senedd in Cardiff, Eleanor Griffith-Jones reports.
Too slow. That's pretty much what Plaid Cymru leader Adam Price thought of some of the Welsh Government's decision-making over the last few months of the pandemic. Why, for one, was anosmia not added to the symptoms list until now, despite numerous opportunities to do so?
Speed of decision-making will no doubt be one of the key questions that a retrospective inquiry will want to look at, as the Health Minister has already alluded this week. You previously said you don't want to get into this now, though I note that Ewan O'Brien, the former Permanent Secretary of the Department of Health in England, has said that you need to begin now because setting up an inquiry, because it can take as much as 6 months.
The First Minister, Mark Drakeford, said he agreed in principle to an independent public inquiry, but wouldn't be drawn in on setting a time for one. As for the time it took to come to decisions, like the one over the loss of smell, well, that one was easy to explain.
We changed the policy in Wales, along with all other nations of the United Kingdom, following a statement from the 4 UK chief medical officers. That was the culmination of the process that began with the Royal College of Surgeons' statement at the end of March.
Last week, the Welsh Government published their exit strategy out of lockdown separately from the other 3 nations. Unlike England's, Wales's traffic light system indicates the level of restrictions on different areas of daily life, like schools reopening. But here lies a mistake, said Tory leader Paul Davies.
You had an opportunity to offer the people of Wales hope that the current crisis will end. Unfortunately, your roadmap offered no timescales and no milestones in order to track its progress, including much-needed milestones around testing capacity and the virus transmission rate.
The First Minister said it was debatable whether timescales were helpful, and they didn't necessarily guarantee anything.
Look how the 1st of June timetable for opening schools in England is falling apart in the hands of the Government of England. How Downing Street last night had to say that the 1st of June was an aspiration, not a deadline, not a timescale after all.
The different lockdown rules could mean that people are now noticing the extent of devolution more as a result of the outbreak, said the Brexit Party leader Mark Reckless. Rules are stricter here than over the border.
Many who had not before understood the scope of devolved powers don't now like the answer. It's because of devolution, because they live in Wales, and because the Welsh Government, and presumably later today, the Senedd, make those laws.
I think people in Wales already know, said the First Minister.
And it is certainly true that people outside Wales and in London appear to have woken up from a 20-year sleep on the devolution agenda. I think people's views in Wales are really clear. People in Wales support a careful, cautious way in which we are exercising the lift out of lockdown.
The press has a role in this, said Plaid Cymru's Delyth Jewell, and maybe the time has come, First Minister, to look at the devolution of broadcasting. In Welsh, she said,
Last week, papers sold in Wales had a front-page advertisement paid for by the UK government with the message "Stay alert," which wasn't applicable to Wales. And the London newspapers are full of stories that are not relevant to Wales, and this isn't being explained and is causing confusion. The same situation does not exist in Scotland, where there are Scottish versions of English newspapers.
The First Minister agreed that it did make the case for devolution stronger for some people in Wales, and he admitted that messages needed to be stronger and clearer for the public here, but said it was difficult for the government to step in too much without causing problems.
Eleanor Griffith-Jones. Now, if the Leader of the Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, gets his way, we've probably seen and heard the last hybrid session of Prime Minister's Questions, where some MPs take part via video link. Mr Rees-Mogg wants to see MPs back at Westminster when the Commons next sits at the start of June. He doesn't think the current arrangements allow for proper parliamentary scrutiny, and he told MPs he was worried that all the bills promised by the government after the election were being held up.
In line with government advice for those who cannot do their jobs from home, I am asking members to return to their place of work after Whitsun. We will not be returning to the crowded, bustling chamber of old. We will be observing social distancing.
But a Lib Dem, Alistair Carmichael, who'd called for a statement, thought the real reason was that a Commons chamber, empty and echoey, didn't suit the Prime Minister's style.
It is widely reported that the motivation for this over-hasty return is to get a support act behind the Prime Minister on Wednesday afternoon. It's even reported today that the leader yesterday suggested that a Commons Commission that to get more MPs in, perspex screens should be installed between the benches between members. Someone has obviously told them how things are being done in Tesco these days.
And Labour's Valerie Vaz was equally concerned.
This is not, Mr Speaker, a battle of government good and everyone else bad, of shirkers versus workers, as some ministers have said. This is about Parliament being a good model employer. We need a phased return, not to overpower the NHS or overpower house staff, where everyone can be safe.
A Conservative, Selene Saxby, was speaking remotely, but she backed the return to normal sittings.
Whilst we have had to improvise due to the unprecedented situation we find ourselves in, we cannot effectively do our jobs from home. We should lead by example when asking the country to return to work.
But the SNP's Tommy Shepherd feared that going back would endanger the lives of MPs' families and constituents. What's more,
this will not affect everyone equally. Those who are older and suffer ill health will be disproportionately affected, as will those who live farthest away. So can I ask, has he undertaken an equalities assessment of his proposal, and does he think that removing the existing arrangements is compatible with the laws on equality of treatment of persons in the United Kingdom?
Jacob Rees-Mogg offered a small concession.
I would like to reassure those members with underlying health conditions who have been told to shield or are receiving specific government advice about their health that we are working with the House authorities to see how they can continue to contribute to proceedings within the House.
The Conservative chair of the Procedure Committee, Karen Bradley, said the change should only be made with the agreement of the Commons. But an opposition attempt to allow MPs a vote on the matter was unsuccessful. And so it looks like we will be back to business as normal when the Commons returns on the 2nd of June. And that brings us to the end of this morning's programme. You've been listening to Yesterday in Parliament with me, Sean Curran. The studio manager was William Allett and the editor was David Cornock. From all of us here, good morning.
BBC News at 9 o'clock. NHS leaders have warned of severe consequences for the health service if the government's test, track and trace system for COVID-19 isn't in place soon. The NHS Confederation has written to the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, saying any further easing of the lockdown depends on a clear strategy and a delay will risk a second peak of the infection. Neil Dixon from the Confederation says the system needs to begin quickly.
It is being done very late in the day. There is concern among those at local level because we've seen often where national stuff is done with the best of intentions, but unless the local context is understood, it doesn't really work as well as it should.
Boris Johnson has pledged to introduce what he's called a world-beating tracing operation by the start of June. The Security Minister, James Brokenshire, insists the rollout is on schedule.
We are confident that we will have the track and trace capabilities, the 25,000 people in place by then. 24,000 people have already been recruited and are in training, and therefore able to provide track and trace for about 10,000 people a day.
Hospital staff in Brighton and Oxford are among thousands of healthcare workers around the world who will begin taking part in a clinical trial today to test whether an anti-malarial drug can protect people from COVID-19. President Trump was criticised earlier this week after he revealed he's been taking hydroxychloroquine. Benefit officials believe that some organised crime groups, as well as individuals, may have taken advantage of the universal credit system in recent weeks. They've told the BBC they fear that as much as £1.5 billion may have been lost in fraudulent claims. Huge demand for the benefit has seen some processes relaxed to ensure the majority of claims are paid quickly. There are signs of a Tory backbench rebellion over the Prime Minister's refusal to scrap the fees some overseas health workers have to pay to use the NHS. The Conservative chairman of the Public Administration Select Committee, William Wragg, has announced he'll support efforts by Labour for an exemption. He says that now is the time for a spirit of generosity towards those who've done so much good. The head of the International Olympic Committee, Thomas Bach, has admitted that the Tokyo Games could be cancelled if they don't go ahead next summer. The Games were rescheduled because of the COVID-19 crisis. Mr. Bach has told the BBC he hopes the Games can go ahead, but he understands the uncertainty if the pandemic isn't under control by next year.
You cannot have the athletes being in uncertainty. You cannot have so much overlapping with the future Olympic Games. So I have some understanding for this approach by our Japanese partners.
BBC News. Now on Radio 4 in the programme first broadcast in 2018, here's Melvin Bragg with In Our Time.
Hello, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is regarded as the greatest chivalric poem of the medieval world. It's set at Camelot at Christmas when a strange green man rides in on a green horse holding an axe and challenges King Arthur to hit him and be hit back. Gawain steps in, takes the axe and chops off his green head, only for the trunk to pick up the head, telling Gawain to meet him next year when he'll do the same to him. The chivalrous Gawain takes up the challenge. It's vividly told, and at its heart is how Gawain approaches his unexpected death the following Christmas, which he both faces up to and yet tries to avoid. With me to discuss Sir Gawain and the Green Knight are Laura Ash, Professor of English Literature at Worcester College, University of Oxford, Simon Armitage, translator of the poem and Professor of Poetry at the Universities of Leeds and Oxford, and Ad Potter, Professor of Medieval English Literature at the University of Bristol and editor of the poem. Laura Ash, what might first audiences have brought to this story when they heard it? What would they know about knights and chivalry and all that?
The first thing they would know is that they're plunged into the foundation myth of Western Europe. The poem begins with the siege of Troy. It tells us in the siege and the assault was cessed at Troy, the both Britain then burnt to Brondus and Ascus. That is, after the siege finished, then history begins. And history begins when Brutus comes to Britain and founds the British line of kings, of whom the greatest king is Arthur. And so we're immediately plugged into the foundation history of the greatness of the country in which we sit in the late 14th century. And the greatest of those kings then is Arthur, on whom we zero in, and we find ourselves at his glorious court. And now the audience can connect with a whole trope of ideas that they have from the Romance, which is the court as a centre of celebration and beauty and perfect knights and perfect ladies and feasting and then questing individual
and you mentioned
knights.
luxury of dress and so on.
Oh, of course, yes, everything you could imagine. And this poem, like all romances, is very interested in the wealth, the riches, the luxury that these people have and possess and display.
It's written in, you guess, around 1370. Can you localise it a bit as well as the date and time?
So, going on the dialect of the poem, we put it in the northwest Midlands, round about the border of, indeed, some of the places it describes, the Wirral, and kind of the top of Wales into the northwest part of England. But the real question is this sense of places that mattered in the British past, the Welsh past, which is the British past.
And it's about the same time that Chaucer's Canterbury Tales came out.
Yes.
And yet this was lost for centuries, and Canterbury Tales spread its wings, and Go Little Book, as Chaucer said, went through the centuries.
I mean, partly that is geographical in terms of Chaucer writing in London and for the courtly audience, but the geography also impinges upon the dialect. Hence, it's not that people in London couldn't necessarily have understood the more northern dialect, although it's possible that they had some difficulty with it, but certainly it's just in different circles, that where things that were written in London were much more easily expanded and transmitted across, things written in provincial centres had to take their chances.
Can you tell us what people would think of as a chivalric code at that time?
The chivalric code is something very slippery. What it ultimately means, it's a term of art for the successful business of being a warrior aristocrat. And in practice, that means a whole load of values that come from really the warrior past: prowess, pride in your skill in warfare, but also added to that Christian values of mercy and purity to some degree, but above all socialized elite values of generosity. What I mean is a whole demeanor of courtesy, generosity to your fellows, loyalty, always keeping your word, magnanimity, a sense of fellowship with those who are like you. And then, of course, in the literature and to some degree in life, the idea of love had entered the chivalric code, that the great knight will also have a noble love of a lady.
Was this, in one way, consciously or unconsciously, you'll tell me, a way to stave off the fact that what they were doing was going around killing people a lot of the time?
I think so, very much. The point about chivalry was it was an attempt to suggest that this hedonistic way of life that the warrior aristocracy of Western Europe led was nonetheless a vocation, that it was an ethical code, that it was something that God would smile upon and that could take you to heaven. And that really was riven with paradoxes that I think this poem takes some time gently to expose.
Simon Armitage, what, in less of a nutshell than I did it, is the story about?
Well, as Laura said, it briefly starts at the siege of Troy, just to establish a bloodline with the founding fathers of Britain. But the inciting incident is the Green Knight entering the hall on a green horse and laying down what seems to be an absurd challenge, a strike for a strike. Arthur picks up the sword. He interprets this as a sort of a martial challenge and is about to wield the weapon when Gawain pops up from his seat. And I think, in terms of thinking of a beheading, he almost literally imagines this as a no-brainer and steps forward and says, let this challenge be mine. He chops the head of the Green Knight off. It rolls across the floor. The Green Knight somehow knows where it is and picks it up again and says, I will see you in a year's time, in a year and a day. So a year goes by and Gawain sets off across the countryside to keep his date with destiny. And at his lowest point, when he's cold, lonely, hungry, exhausted, he makes a prayer, and almost straight away in front of him is this most incredible, beautiful castle into which he is invited. And it's at that point that a story within the story begins, a challenge within the challenge. The master of the house, who we later find out is Lord Bertilac, says to Gawain, we'll play a little exchange game here. I'll go out hunting every day, and what I win in the field I will give to you when I come back, as long as whatever you win in the house during the day you will give to me, which Gawain agrees to. And as soon as the Lord has gone out to make his first hunting trip, Gawain is in bed and he hears the door of the bedchamber open, and in comes Lord Bertilac's wife. And over the course of 3 days, Gawain receives a series of kisses which he has to give to the Lord and Master in return for killed deer and a wild boar and fox. And then comes the moment which really is, highlights Gawain's faults and his flaws, which is that he is offered a magical belt from around the lady's waist, which has life-protecting properties. He agrees to take it and neglects to tell the Lord and Master of the house that he has done. That game comes to an end. A guide takes him towards this mysterious place, the Green Chapel, where Gawain submits to the Green Knight's axe, and again in a series of threes, the Green Knight makes 3 attempts on Gawain's neck, and on the third occasion just skims him. And then there is something of a discussion about what was meant by the whole enterprise, and Gawain returns to Camelot wearing the green belt now as a sash or a baldric, and it's adopted by the Round Table as a mark of their code and honour.
Did you use a lot of alliteration in your translation, which bounds along, which I enjoyed enormously. Was that in the original text? Was that, or did you? That how you set out to do? You talk alliteratively quite a bit at the moment.
I think that's probably a consequence of translating the poem. It's become a kind of Tourette. I can't get rid of it. Yeah, it's absolutely. It is in the poem, and I've talked before about the alliteration within it as being the warp and the weft, the poetic warp and weft, which holds the poem together. Without that alliteration, to me, it's still a great story, but the poetic energy and the poignancy and sometimes the comedy of the poem is lost. And I had a feeling that what's happened over a number of years is that in making faithful restorations and translations of the poem and being loyal to word meaning and definition, you are automatically taken away from the acoustic patterns in the poem. So I took it upon myself to rescore, to reorchestrate the poem with those noises.
And we'll come on, thank you very much. We'll come on to that, a bit more of that in just a couple of minutes, Adam. First of all, the poem was lost for centuries. How did that happen? Well, how was it found is the easiest thing.
Yeah, well, no one seems to have read it. There's very little sign of it being read at the time. It was collected by Henry Savile of Bank, who collected a lot of manuscripts from the north. Then it came into the hands of Sir Robert Cotton, who was a great collector of manuscripts. It almost got burnt in the fire of Ashburnham House in 1731. So we're very lucky to have it. And then it just languished in the British Library. No one read it until the 19th century.
And then it was discovered, and then people took it on, and then they declared it to be unique and the greatest chivalric poem, and so on. You've edited, so Simon was talking about what he did with the language. Can you give us some idea of what the original language sounded like? We're talking about the same time as Chaucer, as I indicated earlier. Can you give us a bit more detail on that, please?
Sure. Well, the key is as Simon says, is alliteration. And what the poem does is to combine alliterative long lines. You see this instantly when you look at the poem in an edition. You've got these long lines, and then you've got the 5 short lines that rhyme. And in these alliterative long lines, the key is the repetition of the same sound at the beginning of stressed syllables.
Such as? You've got the book.
Yeah, I'll read you a bit.
Promise to give us an example.
I will read you 2 alliterative long lines. If ye will listen this lie, but on little wheeler, ye shall tell it as teat, as ye in tune herde. So those are the alliterative long lines where you hear 3 alliterating sounds. It was L in the first one, if you will listen this lie, but on little wheeler. And then a T in the next line. I shall tell it as teat, as in tune herde.
What does all that mean?
If you want to listen to the story for a little while, I will tell it promptly as I heard it recited in public.
Now, this is the same time as Chaucer, and the one that April in his shortest sort, the dropped a marsh, the beginning of Canterbury Tales, then led on, it seemed to have led on to the rest of it. This died away and doesn't seem to have had any impact beyond its own until it was rediscovered, until it was discovered in the 19th century.
I think to some extent that is a sort of product of linguistic history. The English we speak is basically descended from Chaucerian English, so we find Chaucer comprehensible. This poet was writing in a Cheshire dialect, and that has been sidelined really by an accident of linguistic history. That's not the language you and I speak, so we find it really difficult. My students find it very difficult. My students think when they read the poem that this must be a lot older than Chaucer. They cannot conceive that these poets were actually contemporaries. They seem a world apart.
What advantages did the poet get by, say, setting the poem at Camelot and at Christmas?
Camelot, that is the big place where Arthur halts court and puts you straight in the Romance tradition. Christmas seems to be something of a convention of Middle English romances. They like setting their stories at Christmas. The French poets like setting their stories at springtime, at Easter. The English poets like Christmas, And they do that, I think, because it had become in the 14th century the big festival.
Yeah, just on that, because it says at the beginning of the poem that they're all waiting, this entire feast has been served, but Arthur won't sit down until he hears of some aventure, until he has some adventure, some excitement that he can find out about. And it's at that moment, of course, that on cue, the Green Knight rides in.
Almost a case of be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
And the Green Man comes in, at least a head taller than everybody else, and massively built with green hair, clad in green, green feet, on a green horse. I have to say it slowly because of it does sound a bit nursery rhymish, which it wasn't. It was very menacing indeed, and they're overawed by him and so on. Then he begins what becomes the beheading game. He doesn't, in fact, ask to be beheaded, does he? It's Gawain who makes Arthur, first of all, and Gawain who say, we'll behead this man and then see what happens. Is that? You tell me.
Yeah, so we call it the beheading game because it turns up in other texts. And so there is an intertextual reason, a sense that this trope exists in folktale that means that it has to be a beheading game. The earliest version I know of is in a Middle Irish manuscript of about 1100 in which a character called Terror proposes the beheading game, and it's very clear what's happening there.
The beheading game is if you chop my head off, I'll chop yours off.
Exactly.
Right.
And so the idea there is, of course, the test is the hero equal to terror? Can he cope with terror? So you can see it has a folktale root. So there's that reason why it's a beheading game. Then there's the narrative compulsion that if, for example, so the Green Knight, when he comes in, he says, you can tell I come in peace, I'm not armed, and I'm holding a sprig of holly. I also happen to have this 4-foot axe. And he says, if you will exchange a blow for another, then you can have this axe as a present. And so, a clever solution would have been to tap him with the holly, and then, Christmas would carry on. But, of course, then it would be a very short poem. But the final reason that it has to be a beheading game is this crisis precipitated by the fact that Arthur loses his temper. Arthur, who we're told is somewhat childred, he is quite childlike, we're told. He's wild in his brain, we're told. And he grabs the axe and starts swinging it around the Green Knight's head. And at that point, someone has to save the day, and the axe has to be the weapon, and it's then that Gawain steps in. But the meaning of the beheading game, I think, is very important, because the main problem with it is that it's a game. So in all the other versions, some overt meaning is given to it, as in, is our hero equal to terror? Or alternatively, the person who takes up the game is a knight with no identity, no importance, and this is how he acquires his identity. Here, in contrast, we have Gawain, who is the finest knight of the court, who is left, as soon as the Green Knight has picked his head up off the floor, Gawain is left in this absolutely horrific situation whereby he can break his word, lose his honour, and the court will lose its honour forever, or he can keep his word and die, and the court loses its greatest knight and hence loses its honour.
What did you make of that when you came to translate it, Sam? And that Gawain's response, which took it on further?
Well, it's a really fascinating passage. I mean, the whole interchange between the knight and Arthur and then Gawain. As Laura says, it isn't explicitly stated that the challenge needs to be with an axe. It's Arthur who interprets it that way, even though the axe is part of the conversation. And Gawain follows suit. So I think the knight says to him, it needs to be somebody who is brave enough of blood and wild enough in their head. And the passage in which Gawain rises from the table and asks for the challenge to be his is a very handsome section in the poem, and it's also, I think, very telling. It's very skillfully and subtly written. Gawain is very self-deprecating. He describes himself as the weakest and most inexperienced of the knights.
Is that part of the chivalric posture?
He's Arthur's nephew. Tolkien puts it really well. He says
in Tolkien's translation.
In Tolkien's translation, he says something along the lines of, my life means the least if my life is lost. He plays with those L words, and at the same time, I also get the impression that Gawain is seeing this as an opportunity. I think he's something of an opportunist, an opportunity to prove himself in front of Arthur, in front of the court, the Round Table, Guinevere, God, and that's when he comes forward. And I think in that section, we see Gawain's character very beautifully drawn. Both somebody who wants to be courageous and also, save his king from the embarrassment of having to go through with this, absurd challenge. But at the same time, I also think he sees it as an opportunity for promotion.
And Potter, how does the metre of the poem, the small bit of which you read recently, how does it drive the matter in the poem?
I think the metre has some of the same contrasts that the poem does. The poem is so rich in contrasts, in settings, indoor, outdoor, the comfort of indoors, the rigours of outdoor life. And I think what the poet has tried to do with this metre is to find some of that same balance. You get the roughness of alliterative verse, which is not regular in its rhythms. And that roughness is followed by these 5 lines at the end of all of the stanzas, the bob and wheel, that are in flowing and melodious verse. They certainly alliterate, but the rhythm is regular and alternating. So you have 2 very different forms of music. It's what Simon called the kind of acoustic world of the poem is very rich and has these contrasts, which I think the poet wanted.
Would the audience listening at the time, let's presume that like Chaucer's poems, they were read aloud to audiences who wanted to be read aloud to, whether educated or not, we don't know. Some of them certainly were. Would they appreciate all this?
I think they would have understood the language much better than we would. They were also part of a literary tradition, of alliterative poetry, so that some of the specialized diction, which is really hard for modern readers. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of the number of words this poet has for man. If he wants to say man, he can say freke if he wants to alliterate on an F. He can say weir if he wants to alliterate on a W. He can say hazel if he wants to alliterate on H. That diction was more familiar to audiences who had read and heard other poems in alliterative metre.
Yeah. And so they would know what was going on, they would follow it, and it would have been delivered orally, you think, to a court, as it were.
I imagine an oral performance of it myself, yes. And I think some of the structure of the poem, there it is written in 4 fits, makes that 4 parts. Yeah. Sorry, I should have glossed that word. It's in 4 parts, and that, I think, makes it possible to recite it in instalments. And what goes on in the beginning of the poem, when Arthur asks initially for a tale of adventure to liven up his meal on New Year's Day, that is actually the kind of circumstances in which the poem itself may have been recited. So imagine an audience on Christmas Day that needs entertainment, New Year's Day. We want stories, we want to be entertained. That is the situation in the poem itself, and very likely to be the situation outside the poem for the audience.
Laura, he sets off to find the Green Knight and has, this is a year later, and has a fantastical journey. And there's a wonderful description of the seasons changing in that year. Yeah. Beautiful. And then he meets wild beasts and giants, and very briefly we are led to assume, demolishes a lot of them, and on he goes in this one amazing armour, but very wearily, hungrily, often sleeping in the open, we're told, sometimes indoors. Can you, is this a typical quest situation?
This is very beautifully done, because in many ways it is a typical quest situation which echoes the pattern, the structure of all kinds of Arthurian romances, but everything is slightly twisted. So the astonishing description of the seasons is utterly beautiful, poetically beautiful, and it allows us to imagine for a moment that we're in a cyclical world where, winter will come, but then spring will come, everything will renew, and then just as if we're allowing ourselves to rest into that, we're then told, a year yearnus full yearna and yeldus never leaker, the form to the finishment, foldus full selden. A year turns very quickly and does not give back the same. The beginning to the ending very seldom matches. And we have enforced upon us again and again that we're not in a cyclical world, we're in a linear world. Time is passing for Gawain, and he is now approaching his death. And he thinks all the time on this quest of his death, and that is the first twist, because in Arthurian romance, no one ever dies. You know, the threat of death is entirely spurious and invented. And we get that hammered home to us when we're told, oh, and he was attacked by bulls and bears and snakes and dragons and wadrows and giants, and I'm sure he would have died loads of times, says the poet. He literally says, I'm sure he would have died loads, except he was great. And what we've just had in 10 lines... Yeah, that is the way he puts it. And what we've just had in those 10 lines is the whole plot of another Arthurian romance. You know, a whole plot which has him fight ever greater enemies, showing that he's an ever greater knight.
Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point Laura makes, that he doesn't seem to be very interested in the usual stuff of romance, fights with dragons and wild men, because just when he said, you know, he might have been killed very often, the poet says, but the winter was worse.
Whereas not so much that winter
worse. And then you return to an unusual element of realism, these wintry landscapes.
Icicles hanging off his helmet.
Yeah, the beauty of that. The chill of it.
And exactly, so his human body and his shivering and his cold and his fear of death, in comparison with, we've had a description of his gorgeous armour, none of which is going to protect him, because presumably he's going to kneel down and have his head cut off. And so this constant sense of suspense and horror cutting against the structures of the romance.
I think it's also in passages like that that we realise just what a wonderful poet and storyteller the Gawain poet was. All that adventure, which, as you say, takes place very quickly and almost off camera, really, is a prelude to the moment when Gawain will be confronted with this beautiful and very hospitable castle. I mean, we're not talking about sort of you know, a little chef with a sort of you know, a burger bar across the road. We're talking high-end hospitality waiting for it.
I think we can live with that. Can I just ask you one thing before we move on, Laura? This description of the seasons, which is quite wonderful, did it surprise you how accurate? It surprised me how accurate and detailed it was. Laurentian in a way, wasn't it? It's just massive, it's just precise, moving. He's got it. What things happen to colours, heat, the whole thing.
Yeah, it's very meteorological descriptions of what's happening in the sky, what's happening on the land, what's happening to the animals. At the same time, it happens very quickly over about 1.5 sections. It's got to be there. We've got to know that the world has turned on its axis. We've got to know that a year has passed. But I don't think the author wants to get caught up with you know, several stanzas of the passage of time. So although it is beautiful and accurate, very quickly a year has gone by. And if you compare that with the next section of the poem, which is Gawain being armoured and getting dressed and ready to ride out on his horse Gringolet, that takes a lot longer. That's sort of 6, 7, 8 sections.
I wanted to come in on Simon talking about the amazing castle that he encounters, and something that Ad said earlier about the brilliant contrast between outside and inside. This is vital to the romance. In the romance, there are only really 2 places to be. There's inside the court where you're celebrated and feasted, and there's outside the court where you're tested and encounter enemies and obstacles. And the brilliant thing about Bertilac's castle is that Gawain thinks he's inside. He thinks he can relax, and in fact, this is where he is tested.
He's in despair. He hasn't found this place.
He prays.
It's terrible. He looks up and the castle is there. This massive, and he goes in and he's right royally received. There you are.
They're very excited to have him, and they all whisper to each other, "This is great stuff. Now we're going to find out how to be a knight, how to woo the ladies." And this is a joke that goes throughout, because our Gawain is very pure and clean and doesn't want to woo the lady, but everyone around him is saying, "Come on, you're Gawain."
Yes. And you want to come in?
Just to add that Gawain had this reputation of being rather a womanizer, and this obviously was known to the poet, and it becomes known to the people in the poem who have expectations.
Excuse me. We can't leave out a substantial section of the poem where this most beautiful woman, whom he doesn't know is the wife, he's the most beautiful woman in the world, and she comes in, he's lying in bed, and he's been told he can stay there and rest, for the great feat ahead, and she makes a not very clear attempt 3 times to seduce him.
Yes.
I mean, there's nothing hidden about that, is there? I'm not exaggerating.
No, nothing at all.
In fact, I'm being very reticent about it all.
Well, she says several very dangerous things. One is she says they're in complete privacy. And the problem is that in a chivalric honour world, if something isn't known about it, it hasn't really happened. It doesn't have consequences. And she is very direct. She says to him, if you are Gawain, if you care for your courtesy, if you care for your reputation, why have you not asked me for a kiss? Why have you not asked me for more than a kiss? And she pushes him. The poet says she pushed him ever harder each day, and the poet comments at one point, great peril between hem stod, great peril stood between them if Mary doesn't look after her knight.
Simon,
I think it's important to remember at this point, though, that he's being stitched up.
Yeah.
I think in the modern parlance...
But he doesn't know he's being stitched up.
He doesn't know, and actually we don't know at that point
That's right,
either.
We don't know.
But retrospectively, we find out that this is, I think, what the papers these days would call a honey trap. And it's a kind of pincer movement, really, from which Gawain has no option. He even at one point tries to pretend that he's asleep as she comes into the room, and he has to use all his skills as a knight to deflect and parry her advances, and eventually she presses upon him this apparently, allegedly magical belt. She's got the belt in her hand, actually, as she offers it to him. He's already refused a ring, and my feeling is that it's almost out of embarrassment, as much as wanting to save his neck, that he takes the belt.
On that, I think it's important that this isn't just his Christianity versus his chivalry. These are 2 aspects of his chivalry, that he has to be loyal to the Lord and he has to be courteous to the lady. So even chivalry itself doesn't help him in this situation.
No, he has to offend one of them by accepting, what the other person wants.
Is there a distinct change in language in her seduction scenes?
I don't think the language changes a great deal. She is very direct. He is forever tactful, and that tactfulness sometimes consists of misconstruing what she's in fact after. So he's a beautifully courteous knight who tries to find ways of parrying her in a way that doesn't offend her, that doesn't hurt her feelings.
But he's looking after his own code, isn't he? He's looking after the chivalrous code of a knight. He mustn't take advantage when he's being given hospitality of someone connected with those who are giving him hospitality. This would be unchivalrous. Is that right?
That is absolutely right.
So that's tearing away at him as well.
But at the same time, the chivalrous code, as she keeps saying to him, she keeps saying, "You're not going if you won't make love to me," is what she keeps saying. His chivalrous code goes both ways.
I think code is not always a very helpful word. It suggests something very rigid, and I think what the poet sees is that there are ethical conflicts here. On the one hand, of course, he mustn't sleep with a lady. She's the wife of the man who's offering him hospitality. But there are her feelings to consider, and of course there's also his own life to consider when he takes the green girdle. So that there are...
The green girdle is going to protect him from death. Yes, that's the big thing. So he takes it. Later he regrets that and considers himself to have been a coward for taking it, because he knows he's not going to die because of the green girdle.
Yeah, and in some ways, it's only his own moral code that he's gone against there. Nobody ever said at the beginning of the challenge that he wasn't allowed to use a little magic in, when he finally meets the Green Knight in the Green Chapel. That was never one of the agreed terms. But I think it goes against the standards which he has set himself. It's the fact that he decides not to tell Bertilac that he has the belt that is his crime in Bertilac's eyes.
He doesn't do this exchange, and we have to miss out because we're going in this direction or that direction. Very, very, quite long, intense, magnificent hunting scenes, tearing through the forest, catching deer, slicing them up, chasing that wild boar that evades them and turns on their dogs and so they go on and on. They're big scenes. And they're a powerful part of the poem. Why do you think, Ad? Why do you think he concentrated on those to the length at which he did?
On the one hand, I think he loves the contrast between the scenes in the bedroom, where everything's hushed, and
it's cinematic, isn't it? The switch.
And then you get the wild outdoors. Although when I say wild, the thing we need to remember is that the hunt was the most important aristocratic pastime, and if you loved things courtly, you would also love the hunt. So that what we regard as uncivilized, cutting up, slicing up of deer, is for the poet a form of art. There's a way of doing it, a proper way of doing it, and he observes these rituals of courtly life.
But it's amazing detail. I mean, you must have found it quite hard to translate. The absolute detail about how you skin a deer, you cut off this bit for that, and the offal for the dog. It's brilliantly done.
Yeah, by way of research, I went to a deer farm in Todmorden and watched it taking place. I got the impression that as an art, it hadn't really changed over the centuries. Very, very sort of tactfully and skillfully done. But Laura's absolutely right. They are filmic jump cuts that take place, and I think we're being invited through watching these very detailed, quite grisly scenes of internal organs, of flesh, penetration, the chase, the disrobing of animals, as a psychological version of the thoughts which are probably running riot in Gawain's head in the bedroom.
What's so important about him being green, Ad?
Several things seem important. On the one hand, the colour green is associated with nature in the poem. But green was also the colour of the devil, and that becomes very important as the poem moves towards the Green Chapel. Because Gawain at that moment thinks that he's dealing with someone demonic, someone diabolical. So there the colour green takes on a different meaning. It's the association with the devil that matters there.
So we've already heard that the giant has 3 goes to behead him. He misses the first time, misses the second, deliberately, and then he just nicks him on the third time, saying the first 2 times you returned the kisses, the third time you didn't return their belt, but that's a small matter, really. What does that say about the Green? What does that say about the whole enterprise of the beheading, about the Green Knight's position in this and Gawain's position in this?
So at this point, the beheading game and the exchange of winnings game are brought together fatally for Gawain's realisation that he's been stitched up, in Simon's words. And what becomes apparent is that the beheading game was not just a Christmas game, as the Green Knight said it was, the Christmas game that Gawain had pitched to him that left him thinking, as Simon suggested, that why shouldn't I use magic? He thinks, if he might have slipped to be unslain, the slech were noble. If I could use this belt, this magic belt, not to be killed, then it would be a noble device. Seems fair enough. The Green Knight used magic. And so in terms of the chivalric game, he thinks that this is how he will succeed. But when the Green Knight feints at him twice and then nicks his neck and says, oh, you were doing so well, but then you failed in your loyalty on the 3rd day because you took the girdle and didn't give it back. He says, but it's because you loved your life, so I blame you the less. That's okay. But I take a harsher line than Simon on this about what Gawain has done wrong, because I don't think it's... I mean, there's a reading of the poem which is a very amiable reading that says nobody is perfect. This is what Gawain learns. However, I think there's a deep twist that lies underneath, which is Gawain goes to confession the day he goes to the Green Chapel, and we're told he was confessed so clean as they're ready for doomsday. And he says to the guide who takes him there, I won't run away, I trust in God, I trust absolutely in God. And the problem is, this is a lie. He's trusting in a supposedly magic belt. And the irony is, if he had trusted in God, i.e. if he had just gone to his death and accepted what might happen, then nothing would have happened.
Ad, you want to come in?
I think this is very true. For Gawain's perspective on the matter. As far as Gawain is concerned, he's failed miserably. The interesting thing about the poem is that everyone else thinks he's done really well. That includes the Green Knight, who pats him on the back and says, well done. Arthur's Court take a similar view.
Yeah, but here's the thing, though. What's the Green Knight's moral high ground? He has been operated the whole way through by the evil sorceress Morgan Le Fay. What's the court's moral high ground? They're the people who did nothing when this crisis arose, and then when Gawain rode away said, well, that was stupid, who let that happen? So the court is hypocritical and shallow, and the Green Knight doesn't have the moral high ground, and we don't know the poet's opinion, and we don't know God's opinion, and the poet could have told us either.
You bring these contradictions over very clearly, Simon. What did you think of them as you were translating it?
I don't feel that the religious elements are as important in the poem as some other people do. The poem is religious in the sense that it has religious trappings and furnishings, but I think the lesson, if we can put it that way, that Gawain actually learns is one of being human.